Usually, it's the avoidant that does the dumping. It's usually either done by a blindsiding discard or a slow fade out into oblivion. But what happens when it's the anxious partner that dumps the avoidant? Yes, this actually does happen. No, it's not the most common scenario because most of the time, the person that's anxious or allowed themselves to become anxious by staying in a relationship with an avoidant, they're clinging on for dear life, trying to earn the love from the avoidant, trying to walk on eggshells to keep them from running from the relationship. But what happens when the anxious person reaches their breaking point? That breaking point can definitely be hit. The anxious person has not had their needs met. Their needs, their feelings have been dismissed, rejected. And every time they try to get their needs met and try to communicate with the avoidant, it's met with fierce resistance, stonewalling, gaslighting, ghosting for days. And eventually, the person gets to the point where they just can't take it anymore. So they end the relationship. Well, first, how does the avoidant feel about it? They take it as a relief initially because there's no longer pressure on them to meet expectations, no longer pressure for them to be emotionally available for their partner. But at the same time, they take it as confirmation of their preconceived notion. Avoidance, especially dismissive avoidance, they go into a relationship with the preconceived notion that the relationship is ultimately going to fail. They often have one foot out the door from the very beginning. So now, when the relationship ends and their more anxious partner ends it, the avoidant says to themselves, see, I knew this was going to fail. Look, I got rejected, I'm not good enough, etc., etc. And they allow it to feed their already pre-existing insecurities. This is a person that has some deep attachment wounds from childhood, and it stems from childhood emotional neglect, consistent childhood emotional neglect. This is a person that grew up in a household where you don't talk about feelings, where parents don't say things like, I love you. They were not given the love and nurturing in the way that they needed. Their feelings were also routinely dismissed. They weren't able to express themselves if they had any kind of negative emotion. They had to figure out how to process emotions and stress on their own. What they learned to do is to just avoid it, to bottle it up, to not deal with it, put on a happy face, and stuff your feelings. They also learned that emotional closeness isn't safe because they tried to rely on their parents or caretakers for their emotional needs, and they were disappointed, rejected, and sometimes even outright abandoned. This causes them to feel unsafe with emotional intimacy in a relationship. They associate it with rejection and abandonment at the subconscious level. And their subconscious fear is if I lower my wall, my partner is going to figure me out. I'm going to be figured out as not being good enough, and I'm going to get rejected and abandoned. So they have this preconceived notion that rejection, abandonment is inevitable, that they're just not enough for anybody. So when they get dumped, it actually confirms this in their mind, even though it's not reality. The reality is their relationship ended because they were not putting in the effort to meet the wants, needs, and feelings of their partner. They weren't respecting the boundaries of their partner. It was a one-sided relationship where the more anxious person was doing all the work, all the effort, trying to meet the needs of the avoidant, while the avoidant was not working to meet the needs of the anxious person. And eventually it can get to the breaking point. But what about the anxious person's perspective? It's a whirlwind of emotions for the anxious person. On one hand, it's a big boost because they finally feel good for standing up for themselves. They finally recognize that their own wants, their own needs do matter, that their feelings matter, and it's not okay to be in a one-sided relationship where you're endlessly giving and the other person is endlessly taking. And it's a message to themselves that, no, I can receive better, that my worth is not dependent on this person's validation, and I can rely on myself to stand up for myself and hold boundaries when needed. But on the flip side, the more anxious person is also going to have a lot of self-doubt, a lot of guilt, a lot of self-blame, a lot of worry. Did I hurt this person? Did I do the wrong thing? Is this my fault? Did they not meet my needs because I wasn't good enough for them? And those thought patterns can also dominate with a lot of rumination too, going over the entire relationship in their head over and over and over again, replaying every moment, wondering if I said this differently, if I said that differently. But take a step back when you're going through that spiral. If you're the anxious person, regardless of whether they ended the relationship or if you ended it, your worth is not dependent on how they show up. And also, you cannot make anybody show up in a healthy way. You can't make anybody show up in an unhealthy way. This person is an independent, autonomous adult with free will, and they are responsible for their own actions. You don't have to be perfect to be treated well. You don't have to be perfect to deserve love from your partner. You don't have to be perfect to have energy and effort reciprocated your way. You don't have to be perfect to have a partner that cares about your feelings, has empathy for your perspective, and actually wants to meet your wants and needs. You don't have to be perfect, so stop blaming yourself. Sure, look back at mistakes you made and learn from those to do better in the next one. Learn why boundaries are so incredibly important, because chances are, if you held boundaries from the get-go, boundaries being your limits of what you want, don't want, what you need, don't need, what you'll tolerate, not tolerate, and your expectations, if you held boundaries from the get-go, the relationship would have likely been much shorter lived, because a person that's emotionally unavailable generally is not able to sustain a relationship with a person that holds and enforces boundaries. The emotionally unavailable partner tends to approach a relationship with a what's in it for me attitude. How does this person make me feel? Considering the wants, needs, and feelings of their partner is generally not something that crosses their mind. Especially if you're dealing with an avoidant, especially a dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant that leans heavily dismissive, they don't have the capacity to consider the feelings and needs of a person other than their own. They have to be willing and wanting to learn that capacity to get to that point. But they had to fend for themselves fiercely as a child, so their mind is essentially programmed to be self-focused. And yes, it results in selfish behavior. And yes, these behaviors are still also choices, because this is an adult that's responsible for their own actions. And yes, a lot of their behaviors can also be a reflection of their character too, not just their insecurities. But insecurities can also fuel and feed any kind of character weaknesses. That said, you should hold boundaries to protect yourself, and this can be a huge lesson in that. Yes, it's sad to lose the relationship, because if you hold boundaries and this person does not want to meet your boundaries, they might leave. But you will save yourself a lot of time and emotional energy that you would have been investing into a person that's not investing it in you in return. And yes, look back at the relationship. Maybe there were times where you emotionally reacted or behaved in an anxious way that wasn't healthy. Learn to self-regulate and to manage your behaviors, manage your reactions, become more of a responsive person rather than reactive. And by the way, holding boundaries is one of the most secure, responsive things you can do, and it helps keep you in check so you're less emotionally reactive in an anxious way. But don't beat yourself up. If your needs were not getting met, if this person was not putting in the energy to meet your needs and to show care and equal partnership in the relationship, you stood up for yourself, you ended it, you looked out for your own wants and needs in a healthy way, so don't beat yourself up. And you're not responsible for their insecurities. You're not responsible for how they perceive the breakup if you try to do it in a kind and empathetic way. It is their healing journey to do. The avoidant has to want it. You can't force them to. But that said, sometimes being dumped can be a splash of cold water on the face for the avoidant, the wake-up call that they need to get to the point where they're willing to do some self-reflection, some self-analysis, and work towards healing and change. That can be their rock bottom when they lose somebody that they actually care about, at least at some level. But that's up to them. It's not your fault. You didn't cause those attachment wounds, so don't beat yourself up, and pat yourself on the back for finally holding boundaries.